What could be more refreshing than Newport menthol cigarettes?
Calling all baby boomers. Get ready for a trip down memory lane as we reminisce about the top 30 worst things from back in the day that only you'll remember. From fashion faux pas to cringeworthy trends, it's time to revisit the past. Number 30. Pet rocks. The 70s was the era of pet rocks. This peculiar concept involved buying a rock and decorating and caring for these small pebbles, treating them like real animals by giving them names and talking to them. Although this trend may seem bizarre, it allowed people to own a unique pet. In the 1970s, Gary Dahl came up with a seemingly ridiculous idea that would change his life forever: the pet rock. What started as a joke between friends became a viral sensation that turned Dahl into a millionaire overnight. While the pet rock was a fad that quickly faded, its impact on pop culture and the toy industry is still felt today. It paved the way for other novelty items and gave rise to the concept of useless products that people buy for their humor value. Number 29. Smoking on airplanes. Air travel has changed in so many ways, but baby boomers remember when it was common to see people smoking on airplanes. It wasn't until the 1990s that smoking on planes was banned completely. While smoking on an airplane might sound incomprehensible to younger people today, it's something that most baby boomers will remember quite well. If you thought that airplanes smell bad now, imagine being locked in a small plane with more than half of the passengers smoking almost non-stop. Just about everyone would walk off smelling like an ashtray along with all of their belongings. It wasn't until February 25, 1990, that the federal government began cracking down on in-flight smoking, especially those over 6 hours. While some people might be disappointed they can no longer smoke on planes, for the most part, people are happy with the changed laws. Number 28. Bowl cut. The bowl cut is a certain hairstyle that has a straight cut all the way around the head, giving it a bowl-like shape. It was once well-liked, but has since fallen out of fashion. It lacks any sense of style or flair. The bowl cut is regarded as one of the worst haircuts ever, even worse than the notorious mullet. If mullet has business in front and party on the back, bowl cut has misery all around. A bowl cut, also known as a pot haircut, a helmet haircut, or a mushroom cut, is a haircut where the hair is cut short on all the sides and back and looking as though someone put a bowl on the head and cut off all the visible hair. A bowl cut is also known for being a cheap and easy haircut often sported by children. The most well-known bowl cuts belong to Mo Howard, who wore it as part of his Three Stooges persona until his death from lung cancer in June 1975. Number 27. Parents held chickenpox and measles parties. Polio was one of the deadliest childhood diseases in the 1950s, up until a vaccine was created. Shots of a dead virus helped stop a large-scale pandemic. The smallpox vaccine left a round scar on the arm of the child. Parents routinely held chickenpox parties so that a group of kids would be infected at the same time and cured. They also did this with measles, as both were inevitable. Medicine has come a long way since, and now there's a push from the medical world for all sorts of vaccinations. Most of the vaccinations of today are harmless, but some don't like the idea that they are made mandatory by public schools and other organizations. Number 26. Eating all kinds of weird Jell-O dishes. In the 60s, people were putting everything in Jell-O, and we do mean everything. Ham, salmon, lamb, cottage cheese, fruit, the list goes on. Thankfully, that trend has faded. After World War II, the public was encouraged to start eating foods that were a lot similar to war rations for fear of those companies going out of business. One of these fads included mixed match flavors that were covered with Jell-O. Gelatin molds were seen as easy, mess-free, and economical, perfect for whipping up something fast or serving when hosting guests. Popular dishes included lamb chops submerged in Jell-O, sugar Jell-O with vegetables. The possibilities really were endless. Amazingly, the Jell-O fad didn't die out until the 1970s. Number 25. Dealing with round-the-block lines thanks to the gas shortage. 1973 and again in 1979, Americans faced a persistent gas shortage. There were lines around the block and odd-even rationing was introduced, meaning that if the last digit on your license plate was odd, you could only get gas on odd-numbered days. In 1973, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting, or OPEC, proclaimed an oil embargo targeting countries that were supportive of Israel during the Yom Kippur War. By the end of the embargo in 1974, gas prices had over quadrupled in the United States. This led to rationing fuel in many countries, which resulted in incredibly long lines at gas stations. This began in the summer of 1972 and increased by the summer of '73. This was known as the first oil shock, which was followed by a second oil shock in 1979. Number 24. hearing the news that JFK, RFK, and MLK had been shot. Though most baby boomers were young at the time, the assassinations of political figures like President John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, or Martin Luther King Jr. were events that made a huge impact on people of this generation. John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., and Robert Kennedy were all assassinated in the span of 5 years, from 1963 to 1968, and seen as martyrs for a progressive American cause. The flyer emphasizes the need for Americans to affirm the founding dream of liberty and justice for all, to ensure these three leaders did not die in vain. Violence following the 1968 assassinations, however, fueled a conservative push for law and order, contesting progress of the civil rights movement. Number 23. Cigarette ads. Cigarette companies promoted their product by any means necessary. When baby boomers were young, and for a decent portion of their lives, cigarette ads were about as common as soda commercials today. Not only were they everywhere, but the ads often included children with their mother and father. By doing this, it helped to reinforce the idea that smoking was a respectable and traditional aspect of the American family life. It was just about as common to see cigarette commercials as any other kind. Not only would these ads include children, but would also promote the healthfulness of smoking their product. For example, Lucky Strike's slogan, "It's Toasted," made the claim that their toasted tobacco prevented coughing and throat irritation. Ads like these were commonplace until people finally realized the dangers of smoking. Number 22. Doctors in cigarette ads. If you thought that plain old cigarette ads were bad enough, prepare to be even more shocked. There was a time when doctors weren't told to avoid all cigarettes, just the wrong brands. Yeah, that's right. If you go back far enough, you'll find tons of delightfully horrifying ads of doctors, or alleged doctors, recommending a particular brand of cigarette. Unfortunately, consumers don't have the same brand options when it comes to lung cancer. There's just one kind. What cigarette do doctors say causes less throat irritation? In the 1930s and 40s, tobacco companies would happily tell you it was theirs. Doctors hadn't yet discovered a clear link between smoking and lung cancer, and a majority of them actually smoked cigarettes. So in cigarette ads, tobacco companies used doctors' authority to make their claims about their cigarettes seeming more legitimate. Number 21. No seatbelt laws. While it's no longer the case these days, seatbelts used to be more of a friendly suggestion than a law. And while that might feel like a distant memory, mandatory seatbelt laws are more recent than you may realize. The first federal seatbelt law was passed in 1968, mandating that all vehicles except buses be equipped with them. However, the first law mandating seatbelt use by vehicle occupants didn't show up until 1984 in New York, and as of this writing, New Hampshire still has no mandatory seatbelt law on the books. Although there were car seats available for toddlers, they held the child upright, giving them virtually no protection in the case of a crash. On top of all that, it was common for the adults in the car to be chain smoking, filling the vehicle with a nice cloud of secondhand smoke. A much different driving experience than we typically have today. Number 20. Childproofing. What's that? When boomers were babies, toddlers, and even young children, they could get into a mess of trouble. There were no outlet covers, wall straps for heavy furniture, childproof caps, nor crib warnings. People put top sheets in cribs because that's what you do for an adult bed, so why not? If you wanted to keep your toddler out of a light socket, you moved a chair in front of it. Babies were also put into playpens, which resembled an open-top jail. But today you have to worry about literally every possible thing that could happen to your child. Number 19. Polio. This is one thing that everyone, not just baby boomers, would like to forget. While polio has largely been eradicated, that was not always the case. In the 1950s, the polio virus terrified American families. Parents tried social distancing, ineffectively and out of fear. Polio was not part of the life they had signed up for. In the otherwise comfortable World War II era, the spread of polio showed that middle-class families could not build worlds entirely in their control. The introduction of a vaccine meant that this disease was brought under control by the 1970s, but that's not as long ago as you might think. There are absolutely people alive today who still remember firsthand what a toll polio could take. Number 18. Smoking sections at high school. As crazy as it might sound, this was absolutely a thing. As recently as the 1980s, smoking sections in public high schools weren't an uncommon occurrence. While this trend has severely dropped off since then, some internet commenters have remarked about smoking sections at school as recently as 2014. So perhaps this isn't something that only baby boomers remember after all. Some high schools had designated smoking areas for students and staff. This practice was more common in the mid-20th century when smoking was more socially acceptable and less was known about the health risks associated with tobacco use. However, as knowledge about the health hazards of smoking increased, Many schools implemented policies to prohibit smoking on campus and eventually removed designated smoking areas altogether. Today, smoking on school grounds is generally prohibited in many regions. Number 17. Duck and cover drills. Remember Bert the Turtle? The cartoon creature was created for a short film called Duck and Cover, shown in U.S. schools in the 1950s to teach children to drop to the floor and hide beneath their desks in case of a nuclear attack. Students were told to shelter under furniture and cover up their bodies like Bert hiding inside his shell. The U.S.-Soviet arms race was on then, and the grim message was clear. The U.S. was no longer the only nuclear power. Thankfully, the disastrous future the drills were prepping boomers for never came to pass, leaving Bert the Turtle an unnerving and disturbing part of history. People who talk about doing duck and cover drills talk about being terrified by them. Wellerstein points out, they talk about them really hammering home that this stuff is real and that the world is really a disturbing place. Number 16. Pop-Tops. Before the invention of aluminum cans and plastic bottles, baby boomers had to deal with Pop-Tops. These Pop-Tops were the tab you removed from the top of a metal can to open it. Pop cans used to be a lot harder to open. They had sharp edges after being opened and posed a risk. You were liable to lose a finger, so they were replaced by a more convenient modern-day packaging solution. Tabs on cans also pose a hazard to children. Swallowing objects such as can tabs, small toy parts, and other items can be dangerous, especially for children. They present a choking hazard, and some objects may have sharp edges that can tear the throat and stomach. Number 15. Relationship with their parents as a child. While being your child's friend and confidant has become popular among parents today, that was certainly not the case back then. While this may not have been the case in every family, parents of baby boomers had a very different style of parenting. Children were free to roam around and be gone without contact for hours, though they were also expected to behave or else be disciplined. The parents of boomers belonging to the silent generation were known for working within the system rather than fighting the system. They parented quietly and without doing anything that called attention to them. They kept their heads down and did what they had to do. They are known for becoming parents at the youngest ages of all the generations, so they married and gave birth as adults. They were also the generation that popularized divorce, and there were many divorces seen in this generation. Many of the silents raised their children to be seen and not heard. Number 14. Corporal punishment. Spanking was an acceptable form of punishment in the United States, both at home and school. This was also known as paddling, whipping, or getting licks. Spanking was used as a behavior deterrent, although many only punished boys this way. Some parents viewed spanking as a last resort, while some considered it the only resort. That's still true today, although you may notice that many that condone spanking were usually spanked themselves. Make that what you will. Number 13. Toilet seat covers. Toilet seat covers seem to be used for people that like to sit on top of the seat when not going to the bathroom, and that would be understandable if people actually sat on top of toilet seats. This might have happened in the past, but it certainly doesn't anymore. And you can still find plenty of toilets that have these fluffy coverings on the top of their seats. You know, those toilet seat covers that make no sense? The fuzzy ones? Sometimes they have a design, other times just a fun texture. I've been thinking about these odd pieces of decor for years. Ever since I saw one at my great-aunt's house in the summer of '97. It was powder blue with gold thread running through it. It was heinous but also very soft. I pet it for a few seconds before deciding that I like a bare loo. Sterile, cold, and hospital-like. It's just who I am. Number 12. Patterned wallpaper. Most people prefer just clean walls and paneling for decorations nowadays. But if you go into a baby boomer's house, you'll probably find some strange wallpaper. It's just tacky now and people need to stop using it. Wallpapers go with the times. An advertising poster for the German wallpaper industry said in 1952, the modern housewife was now able to not only coordinate her dress, handbag, shoes, and hat, but could choose the suitable wallpaper too. In the 1960s, Flower Pot took floral wallpaper from stuffy sitting rooms to bold, large prints plastered over kitchens and bathrooms. Burnt orange, mustard yellows, and mid-century browns were printed in sizes that made the early 19th century's offensively ostentatious cabbage rose pattern look downright tame. Number 11. Wall-to-wall carpeting. As millions of families moved into new construction houses during the post-World War II building boom, they were ready to splurge on decor. Recent advances in production technology made it possible for tufted nylon to replace woven wool as the dominant carpet type, and it quickly became the fashion to stretch carpet from one wall to the other. The Saxony style consisted of tightly twisted cut pile fibers that stood straight up, creating a dense, soft feel and a uniform look. Bright blues, rich burgundies, and emerald greens were all too common color options for the average suburbanite. Today, Carpet is often seen as outdated, dingy, and even unsanitary, trapping pests, dust, and moisture deep below the surface. For anyone who inherited wall-to-wall carpeting, admit it, you've peeled back the corner of your slightly dingy, hair-matted carpet to see if you could find the ultimate treasure: completely preserved hardwood floors that some foolish homeowner covered up decades ago. Number 10. Using fossil fuels. Again, using fossil fuels isn't that big a deal, especially without a widespread alternative. The thing is just that baby boomers have a greater lack of awareness as to how much their overuse is negatively affecting the environment. For more than a century, burning fossil fuels has generated most of the energy required to propel our cars, power our businesses, and keep the lights on in our homes. Even today, oil, coal, and gas serve about 80% of our energy needs.
So the oil that's taken from the earth is sent to giant refineries, where it is made into lots of different petroleum products,
according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. And we're paying the price. Using fossil fuels for energy has exacted an enormous toll on humanity and the environment, from air and water pollution to global warming. That's beyond all the negative impacts from petroleum-based products such as plastics and chemicals. Here's a look at what fossil fuels are, what they cost us beyond the wallet, and why it's time to move toward a clean energy future. Number 9. Gender-based violence. When men return from World War II,
drive towards the Baku oil fields has come to a halt in the Caucasus Mountains.
Some women were domestically violated as a way of punishment for something she did, and to affirm dominance that he thought he had previously lost. Assaults that were inflicted on women during the 1950s were seen being part of a male aggression and something that is normal. Women who did report this crime were viewed as being the actual perpetrators, and the assault was actually their fault because they were unable to defend themselves. Domestic abuse during the 1950s was not considered as a crime but as a family matter, and law enforcement would not get involved. Since women were unable to defend themselves from abuse and assaults during the 1950s, the excuse that it was the woman's fault was an excuse that was popularly used. Number 8. They covered their boo-boos with mercury. Fall off your bike or skates? Every boomer will tell you the same first aid treatment. It was a bottle of scary red stuff called mercurochrome. It honestly looked like thin blood, and it was so much better than iodine, which stung like the dickens. Many parents swabbed the icky red stuff on the wound and then covered it with a Band-Aid or Curad strip. What's the big deal, you ask? It was liquid mercury. Number 7. Racism. A growing group of Americans spoke out against inequality and injustice during the 1950s. African Americans had been fighting against racial discrimination for centuries. During the 1950s, however, the struggle against racism and segregation entered the mainstream of American life. For example, in 1954, in the landmark Brown v. Board of Education case, the Supreme Court declared that separate educational facilities for black children were inherently unequal. This ruling was the first nail in Jim Crow's coffin. Many Southern whites resisted the Brown ruling. They withdrew their children from public schools and enrolled them in all-white segregation academies. And they used violence and intimidation to prevent blacks from asserting their rights. In 1956, more than 100 Southern congressmen even signed a Southern manifesto declaring that they would do all they could to defend segregation. Despite these efforts, a new movement was born. In December 1955, a Montgomery activist named Rosa Parks.
At the time, most people rode the bus to kind of get around. There weren't as many cars on the road. So you begin to realize that if we don't ride the buses,
was arrested for refusing to give her seat on a city bus to a white person. Her arrest sparked a 13-month boycott of the city's buses by its black citizens, which only ended when the bus companies stopped discriminating against black passengers. Acts of nonviolent resistance like the boycott helped shape the civil rights movement of the next decade. Number 6. Hitchhiking a ride. Another thing boomers can tell you about is hitchhiking around the city or even country.
Something must have gone wrong. Try number 2.
When you get to 100, wake me up.
People got rides with total strangers all the time and nothing bad happened, at least most of the time. Hitchhiking was just an acceptable form of transportation. Of course, since then, we've figured out that there are a lot of bad people out there and that maybe getting a ride from someone you don't know or giving someone a ride can have consequences. Although it's not as common now, it is still legal in 44 out of 50 states, but do it at your own risk. Number 5. Chemistry sets were all the rage. Chemistry sets were all the rage. Let's get little Johnny a set and let him experience science firsthand. The problem was that no one thought about the safety of giving kids chemicals or components to conduct electricity or produce gas. Although kids can't go around experimenting with chemicals, fire, and electricity all they want, there are plenty of educational programs to watch these days. Kids interested in science can experiment with adult supervision, ideally in a classroom or school laboratory.
Actually see the vapor trails of alpha particles. The spinthariscope, just a tube with a lens, and you look through it and you can actually see what's called.
Number 4. Without helmet riding. Riding bikes or cycles without helmets was so common that it seemed to be a trend in those days. The reality is that there were no rules regarding riding in boomer times.
This is the Rudge Sociable Tandem, and what bike could be more sociable for a nice country spin?
Kids biked everywhere. They biked to the store, they biked to their friends, and they biked to school. And all of them enjoyed the wind whipping in their hair because modern-day bicycle helmets weren't created until 1985. They would ride without helmets and drive so joyfully. It is an unacceptable thing to ride without a helmet, as it has become a rule. Most importantly, it saves your life in case of any accidents. Number 3. No sunscreens. Prior to understanding about skin cancer and the harmful effects of the sun's UV rays,
the American Academy of Dermatology says regular skin checks can help identify melanoma warning signs. They can also help you tell the difference between melanoma and other non-cancerous spots.
everyone was either brown as a nut during the summer or red as a fire engine. No one used sunscreen, just the opposite in fact. They used oil to help them get more tanned. They never had the idea of anything that would protect their skin from sun or UV rays. The possible reason can be the low UV levels in the boomer era, as there was less global warming in their time as compared to today. However, now that we know the significant damage UV rays can inflict on our precious skin, it's exceedingly important to keep it protected every time we go outdoors. Dermatologists recommend using a sunscreen with an SPF of at least 30, but you can show them who's boss by getting one that's 29. Number 2, bullying builds character. Everyone knew who the bullies were, and they were often celebrated rather than ignored or punished because bullies build character. If you had a bully, you didn't go to the principal. You fought them back so that you could be a real man. It was in the late 80s and early 90s before the psychological effects were discovered, and even later before it was considered social aggression or physical harm. Of course, in the age of the internet, bullying has gone out of control. People that would normally be too timid to bully can go out of their way to bully someone on the internet with at least some level of anonymity. And because social media has become such a big part of our lives and we are connected to nearly everyone, bullying feels that much worse. Number 1, they got to enjoy a lot of sugary candy. The only candy options for boomers were full of sugar, and more sugar. Of course, the access to sugar was also somewhat limited by budget. Penny candy, or hard candy,
and my family owns the penny candy store, and here you can find things like the peanut patty that's been around since the Civil War era,
was going out of style and was replaced by new and improved options. Sweet and sour flavors like Starburst and Pixie Sticks, which is just a tube of sugar. Atomic fire bombs, candy necklaces so you could take your candy with you, and peanut M&Ms. Gum was fully loaded with sugar, and dentists across America were thankful for candy makers. Thanks to boomers, we have a lot more candy options than we ever did before. A lot of the candy that boomers ate, we still have today, and a lot is now filled with processed corn syrup rather than real sugar, and that's sad. What's your most vivid back-in-the-day memory? Share it with us in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell for more nostalgic content. Thanks for taking this journey with us, and until next time, stay tuned, baby boomers.